Good evening, one and all. Good evening, one and all. We welcome you all to the International Conference on World Breastfeeding Week, Breastfeeding, Diet and Nutrition, Parenting, Education, Health, Well-being, Environment, and Sustainable Development 2024, commemorating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, nation celebrating 76 years of independence and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2015 to 2030 as part of awareness and campaigns. In collaboration with Sri Holistic Health Foundation India and Sri Research Institute Center for Art, Sciences and Wellbeing, an international and national fraternity. So today, before we start our sessions, let's take the blessings of Almighty.
कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शत्रुबुद्धिविनाशाय दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः
With the blessings of Almighty, we shall continue with today's commemorations. Today, we are commemorating International Day of the World Indigenous People. Centuries-old marginalization and other varying vulnerabilities are some of the reasons why indigenous people do not have the same possibilities of access to education, health system, or digital communications. This year, with the theme Protecting the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Voluntary Isolation and Initial Contact. Every year on 9th August, International Day of World's Indigenous People is celebrated. Indigenous people make up less than 6% of the global population, but they represent at least 15% of the extremely poor. Indigenous peoples' territories encompass 28% of the surface of the globe and contain 11% of the world's forest. They are guardians of most of the world's remaining biodiversity. Indigenous people's food systems have high levels of self-sufficiency, ranging from 50 to 80% in food and resource generation. Around 200 groups of indigenous peoples currently live in voluntary isolation and initial contact. They reside in remote forests, such in rich in natural resources in Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, India, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Peru, and Venezuela. They choose to live detached from the rest of the world, and their mobility pattern allows them to engage in gathering and hunting, thereby preserving their cultures and languages. These peoples have a strict dependency on their ecological environment. Any changes to their natural habitat can harm both the survival of individual members and the group as a whole. Despite their right to autonomy as enshrined in the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact face unique challenges often overlooked by the surrounding world. Developments for agriculture, mining, tourism, and natural resources in their territories is resulting in the deforestation of swaths of indigenous people's forest, disrupting their way of life and destroying the natural environment that they have protected for generations. For indigenous people living in voluntary isolation and initial contact, one of the most serious threats from external contact is exposure to diseases. Due to their isolation, they do not have the immunological defenses to relatively common diseases. As such, forced contact with the outside world can lead to devastating consequences and can destroy the whole societies. The International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples 2024 is focusing on protecting the rights of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact are the best protectors of the forest, where their collective rights to lands and territories are protected. The forests thrive alongside their societies, and not only is their survival crucial to the protection of our planet, but it is crucial to the protection of cultural and linguistic diversity. In today's hyper-connected world, the existence of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact is a testament to the rich and complex tapestry of humanity and is a huge loss to our world if they cease to exist. We need indigenous communities for a better world. There are an estimated 476 million indigenous peoples in the world living across 90 countries. They make up less than 6% of the world's population, but account for at least 15% of the poorest. They speak an overwhelming majority of the world's estimated 7,000 languages and represent 500 different cultures. Indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and the ways of relating to people and environment. They have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. Despite their cultural differences, indigenous peoples from around the world share common problems related to the protection of their rights as distinct peoples. Indigenous peoples have sought recognition of their identities, their way of life, and their right to traditional lands, territories, and natural resources for years. Yet, throughout the history, their rights have been violated. Indigenous peoples today are arguably among the most disadvantaged and vulnerable groups of people in the world. The international community now recognizes that special measures are required to protect their rights and maintain their distinct cultures and the way of life. In order to raise awareness of the needs of these population groups, every 9th August commemorates the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, chosen in recognition of the first meeting of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations held in Geneva in 1982. This decade is also known as Decade of Indigenous Languages from 2022 to 2032, as at least 40% of the 7,000 languages used worldwide are at some level of endangerment. Indigenous languages are particularly vulnerable because many of them are not taught at school or used in the public sphere. This year, we start another important milestone to advocate for indigenous cultures, the Decade of Indigenous Languages, as was introduced in 2020. And now in 2024, we are having the updates on this decade after 2 years. So the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed the period between 2022 and 2032 as International Decade of Indigenous Languages, in short known as IDIL, 2022 and 2032, to draw global attention on the critical situation of many indigenous languages and to mobilize stakeholders and resources for their preservation, revitalization, and promotion. The proclamation of an international decade is a key outcome of 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages, for which the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, lead global efforts. The organization will continue to serve as lead UN agency for the implementation of the International Decade in cooperation with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA in short, and other UN relevant agencies. When we look at the background, as we need indigenous communities for a better world, and indigenous peoples have sought recognition of their identities, their way of life, and their right to traditional lands, territories, and natural resources for years. Yet, throughout history, their rights have been violated. In order to raise awareness of the needs of these population groups, every 9th August commemorates the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, chosen in recognition of the first meeting of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations held in Geneva in 1982. By resolution 49 by 214 of 23rd December 1994, the United Nations General Assembly decided that the International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples shall be observed on 9th August every year. The date marks the day of first meeting in 1982 of the UN Working Group in Indigenous Populations of Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. As requested in the outcome document of the 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, a UN system-wide action plan on the rights of indigenous peoples was developed by the later agency support group on indigenous issues in 2015. In consultation with indigenous peoples, UN member states, UN agencies, and other stakeholders, it aims to ensure a coherent approach to achieving the ends of UN Declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, including through improved support to member states and indigenous peoples. In terms of special events related to indigenous peoples, in 1990, the UN General Assembly proclaimed in 1993 1993 as the International Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples, as per Resolution 45 by 164 and 47 by 75. Later, the General Assembly established two international decades of World Indigenous Peoples, the first 1995 to 2004, Wide Resolution 48 by 163, and the second 2005 to 2014, Resolution 59 by 174, with the goal of strengthening international cooperation for solving problems faced by indigenous peoples in areas such as human rights, the environment development, education, health, economic, and social development. 2022 marks the beginning of a new decade for the indigenous community. The celebration of the decade of indigenous languages from 2022 to 2032, a door that was opened previously in 2019 with the celebration of International Year of Languages. Let's watch a short video. In the meanwhile, I request all the presenters who have registered for presentation, kindly share your details in the chat box so that we can invite you after these commemorations for presentations.